The evening had started like any other high-profile political gathering. Nancy Pelosi, former Speaker of the House, had been invited to speak at an elite fundraising event in San Francisco, a city that had long been a stronghold of her political influence. The ballroom was filled with top donors, political allies, and media representatives eager to hear what she had to say about the state of American politics. She entered the stage with the poise and confidence that had defined her decades-long career. Dressed in an elegant navy blue pantsuit, she approached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and flashed a rehearsed yet warm smile. The applause was polite but not as enthusiastic as she was used to. The teleprompter glowed in front of her, guiding her through the speech. She began her remarks with a call for unity, touching on key Democratic talking points, protecting democracy, the importance of bipartisanship, and the challenges of the current political climate. But something was off. A low murmur began rippling through the audience. People shifted in their seats, exchanged glances, some even checking their phones instead of listening. And then, out of nowhere, it happened. A single boo echoed from the back of the room. Pelosi hesitated for a fraction of a second, her political instincts kicking in as she continued speaking. But before she could move past it, more voices joined in. Boo! This wasn't just one or two hecklers, it was growing. A wave of discontent spread through sections of the audience. Pelosi's eyes scanned the crowd, searching for the source. This wasn't a rally filled with her usual opponents. These were people who had once supported her. People who had donated to her campaigns. People who had once cheered for her name. For the first time in a long while, she looked caught off guard. And what she did next would make headlines across the country. Nancy Pelosi had been in politics long enough to handle a few hecklers, but this was different. The boos weren't dying down. In fact, they were getting louder. She paused mid-sentence, gripping the podium a little tighter, her polished demeanor slipping for just a moment. The murmurs had turned into open discontent. From the back of the room, a voice cut through the noise. What about the economy, Nancy? Another followed. What have you done for us? Pelosi's smile tightened. She had faced opposition before, but not from this kind of crowd: wealthy donors, business elites, and political strategists who had, until now, stood behind her. A cameraman in the front row, sensing the tension, zoomed in on her face, capturing the slight flicker of unease. The footage would later go viral. She finally raised a hand, signaling for the audience to quiet down. The noise simmered, but not completely. I hear you, she said, her voice even but edged with frustration. Believe me, I understand your concerns. Asterisk, asterisk. It was a classic Pelosi move: calm, controlled, attempting to reassert dominance over the room. But then, a bold voice from the side interrupted her again. Then why aren't you listening? The crowd erupted again, some clapping in agreement, others shouting more questions. This wasn't just a few disgruntled attendees. It was turning into an outright revolt. For the first time in years, Nancy Pelosi was losing control of the room. And she knew it. For a split second, Nancy Pelosi froze, a moment so brief that the casual observer might have missed it. But to those who had watched her dominate political arenas for decades, it was undeniable. She was rattled. She had walked into this event expecting applause, respect, and admiration, not a chorus of boos and direct confrontations. The realization hit her fast. This wasn't just a few troublemakers stirring the pot. This was her own base turning on her. The energy in the room had completely shifted. The once friendly audience was now a mix of angry voices, skeptical glances, and outright hostility. Some had their arms crossed, while others were shaking their heads in disbelief. A man near the stage stood up, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. Nancy, you've been in Washington for over 30 years. Why are things worse than ever? Scattered cheers and claps erupted from different corners of the room. Pelosi's polished, rehearsed smile faltered. She had debated presidents, outmaneuvered political opponents, and handled ruthless media attacks. But she wasn't prepared for this. The pressure was mounting. Cameras were rolling. Journalists in the back were scribbling notes. And social media was already catching fire with people live tweeting the disaster in real time. Pelosi held up her hand again, signaling for quiet. This time, the crowd hesitated, some falling silent, others still murmuring. Her voice lowered, her tone shifting from defensive to slightly condescending. "I understand that emotions are running high," she said carefully, trying to diffuse the situation. "I have spent my entire career fighting for the American people. I have worked tirelessly too." She was cut off. Then why aren't things better? Someone yelled. Boom. That one question, delivered with unfiltered frustration, hit harder than any political attack she had ever faced. The murmurs turned into a new wave of boos, louder than before. Nancy Pelosi's face hardened. She took a deep breath, eyes scanning the audience for a friendly face, someone who would nod along, clap at her words, give her the reassurance that she still had control. But she found nothing. Even her most loyal supporters in the room were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, too afraid to defend her in this moment. They knew what she knew. She was losing them. The political instincts that had served her so well for decades were failing her now. And it was only going to get worse. The tension in the room was palpable. Nancy Pelosi could feel it, the loss of control, the shift in power dynamics, the realization that the people she once counted on were no longer on her side. For decades, she had commanded respect in political arenas. She had silenced opponents with her sharp wit, outmaneuvered rivals with her political cunning, and owned the room wherever she spoke. But tonight, she was on the defensive. She took a sharp breath, straightened her shoulders, and leaned forward into the microphone. This was her last chance to turn this around. "I have spent my entire life serving this country," she began, her voice laced with a controlled frustration. "I have fought for healthcare, for women's rights, for working families. I have stood against corruption, and boo." Another wave of boos rolled over her words, drowning them out completely. Pelosi stiffened, gripping the edges of the podium. She had been interrupted before, but never like this. A voice from the back shouted, "Then why are you still in power? It's time for new leadership." The crowd erupted in agreement. More people were nodding, murmuring, some even clapping at the remark. Pelosi's lips pressed into a thin line. She was losing them fast. She tried again, her voice sharper now. "I have always stood up for democracy. I have defended your rights against extremist threats." "And what about our economy?" someone shot back. "What about crime in your own city?" More cheers, more boos. For the first time in years, Nancy Pelosi looked cornered. Pelosi glanced at her aides near the stage, silently pleading for direction, but they looked just as frozen as she felt. One of them mouthed something, trying to give her guidance. But before she could react, something unexpected happened. A young man in the middle of the audience suddenly stood up and raised his phone. "We're recording this," he declared. "The whole world is watching, Nancy." And just like that, the energy in the room exploded. Phones shot up in every direction. Live streams started. People knew they were witnessing something historic. Pelosi's eyes widened for just a second. She was officially in a no-win situation. She had two choices: try to regain control and risk saying something that would only fuel the fire. Walk away and let the internet run wild with the footage. Neither option was ideal. And what she did next would determine how this moment would be remembered forever. Nancy Pelosi's mind raced. She had been through decades of political battles, but this was different. The boos weren't stopping. The murmurs had grown into outright defiance. Every time she tried to speak, another person shouted over her. Every pause in her speech was met with another piercing question, another criticism, another wave of frustration. And now, With hundreds of phones recording, live streaming this disastrous moment, the pressure was suffocating. She knew exactly what would happen next. The videos would be online within minutes. By morning, conservative outlets would have a field day. Headlines would scream, "Pelosi humiliated at own event. Nancy booed off stage. Total collapse. Watch Pelosi lose her own supporters live." She had been in politics long enough to know how this worked. The narrative was already writing itself. And the worst part? She had no control over it. Pelosi lifted her hands in an attempt to calm the room. Her voice, once strong and unwavering, now carried a hint of strain. "I understand the concerns," she said, trying one last time. "I hear you, but let me be clear. Boo!" Another wave of boos. Louder than before. She closed her eyes for a brief second, trying to contain her frustration. She was Nancy Pelosi, the most powerful woman in Congress for decades. And yet, at this moment, she was just another politician who had lost touch with her own people. Then, from the front row, a man in a suit leaned forward, smirking. "Nancy, maybe it's time you stepped aside," he said casually, loud enough for the microphones to pick up. The crowd erupted. Some cheered, others laughed. Pelosi's face darkened. Her eyes locked onto the man for a second, sharp, furious. Then, without another word, she did something nobody expected. She turned away from the podium and walked off stage. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Did she just leave? The cameras followed her every step, capturing the moment she disappeared behind the curtains, surrounded by a swarm of anxious aides. The room erupted into chaos. Some people clapped, others laughed in disbelief. Some, still loyal, stood frozen, unsure how to react. But it was too late. The internet had already won. Within minutes, the first videos started circulating. By the next morning, her walk-off was the #1 trending topic in the country. And for the first time in her career, Nancy Pelosi had to face a political storm she couldn't spin in her favor. Nancy Pelosi hadn't even left the venue yet, but the damage was already done. Inside the private VIP lounge, away from the audience, she stood rigid, her phone buzzing nonstop as aides whispered in hushed, panicked voices. The first clips were already online, and they were spreading like wildfire. Twitter, now X, exploded within minutes. Hashtags started trending almost instantly. Hashtag Pelosi meltdown. Hashtag booed off stage. Hashtag time to retire Nancy. On YouTube, political commentary channels were pumping out reaction videos at lightning speed. Breaking. Nancy Pelosi just had the worst night of her career. 80K views in 20 minutes. Pelosi loses IT. Walks off stage after brutal boos minus 120K views and climbing. Even mainstream media outlets were forced to cover it. Fox News ran the headline. Pelosi stunned as own supporters turn against her. CNN hesitated, then settled on a softer approach. Nancy Pelosi faces rare backlash at fundraiser. But regardless of how it was spun, the reality was clear. This was a PR disaster. And Nancy Pelosi knew it. Inside the lounge, she threw her phone onto the table, face tight with anger. Her most trusted advisor, a woman who had been with her for years, took a deep breath before speaking. "Madam Speaker, we need to get ahead of this." Pelosi's eyes narrowed. "How? It's already out there. There's nothing to get ahead of." Her voice was low, sharp. One of her younger aides, still glued to his phone, suddenly paled. Ma'am, it's even worse than we thought." He turned his screen around, showing a new tweet that had just gone viral. Pelosi didn't just walk off stage, she ran from her own people. Attached was a slowed-down clip of her leaving the stage, carefully edited to make it look like she was storming off in rage. The caption below sealed it. "This is not leadership." 3.1 million views in 30 minutes. Pelosi clenched her jaw. Her mind was already racing through damage control strategies, but the problem was, this wasn't Washington. She couldn't control this narrative. She couldn't spin this one away. This was the internet. And once the internet took over, there was no stopping it. Nancy Pelosi sat silent, staring at the phone screen in front of her. The headlines were getting worse. She had seen media storms before, but this was different. This wasn't a political attack from conservatives. This was her own party turning against her. Breaking. Major donors reconsidering support for Pelosi. Pelosi walks off stage, a symbol of failing leadership? Even Democrats are asking, is it time for new leadership? But then came the worst part, the silence from her closest political allies. Pelosi immediately checked social media for support from top Democrats. Nothing. No official statements. No defensive tweets from her allies. No public backing. Kamala Harris? Silent. Chuck Schumer? No comment. Even The View, the show that once praised her endlessly, didn't defend her. Instead, some of her longtime supporters were carefully backing away. A well-known progressive journalist tweeted, "Nancy Pelosi has been an icon in Democratic politics, but maybe it's time for fresh leadership." The reaction at this event speaks volumes. This one tweet alone got over 500K likes in an hour. Another former Democratic strategist went even further. It's time for new energy in the party. The crowd's reaction to Pelosi was a warning sign that should not be ignored. Inside her private office, her team was in full panic mode. One aide, trying to keep it together, finally broke the silence. "Madam Speaker, we need a statement. We can't let this get worse." Pelosi shook her head, still staring at her screen. She wasn't just losing a news cycle. She was losing her grip on power. The backlash wasn't just an internet storm anymore. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Nancy Pelosi had spent decades at the top of Washington's power structure. She had faced presidents, opposition leaders, and media attacks, but nothing felt like this. She was losing control. Not to Republicans, not to Fox News. She was losing control of her own party. Pelosi's team had spent hours crafting a damage control strategy. The plan? A carefully worded statement acknowledging the backlash, but shifting blame onto frustration over national issues rather than her leadership. It wasn't a great plan, but it was all she had. Then a new headline popped up. Breaking. Senator Adam Wilcox calls for new leadership in the Democratic Party. Pelosi's eyes narrowed. She knew Adam Wilcox. He was a rising star in the Democratic Party, young, charismatic, and dangerously ambitious. And now, he was using this moment to take a shot at her. She clicked on the video attached to the article. Wilcox was standing in front of reporters, choosing his words carefully, but the message was clear. "Nancy Pelosi has done incredible work for our country," he began. "But there comes a time when we need to ask ourselves, is it time for a new generation of leadership?" The reporters swarmed. "Are you saying she should step down?" one shouted. Wilcox smirked, shaking his head slightly. "I'm saying the people are speaking, and we need to listen." Boom. Pelosi felt a cold wave wash over her. She had mentored Wilcox, helped raise funds for his campaigns, introduced him to powerful donors, and now he was throwing her under the bus. She turned to her aides, her voice tight. "Get me Schumer." Her assistant froze. "Madam Speaker?" Schumer just released a statement. Pelosi's heart sank. She grabbed a phone and pulled up the news. "Chuck Schumer, we must respect the opinions of the public amid Pelosi backlash." That was Washington speak for. "You're on your own." Pelosi felt it all at once. The booze at the event? That was the beginning. This was the real power shift. Washington was already moving on from her. And for the first time in her career, Nancy Pelosi had to face the fact that she might not be able to fight her way out of this one. Nancy Pelosi sat in her private office, staring at the chaos unfolding on every news channel. Her own party was abandoning her. Her colleagues were silent. And the headlines wouldn't stop coming. Pelosi's political future in jeopardy as party distances itself. DNC insiders. Pelosi no longer the face of the future. Even her closest allies are staying quiet. That says everything. She had spent decades controlling the game. But now, she was the one being pushed out. Her phone buzzed another call from a top donor. She didn't answer. For the first time in her career, she had no words. Her closest aide, a woman who had been by her side for years, walked in and spoke softly. "Madam Speaker, it's time. We need to respond." Pelosi nodded slowly. She knew what had to be done. This wasn't just about damage control anymore. It was about legacy. She stood up, adjusted her blazer, and walked to the podium in front of the cameras. The room was silent, the air tense. She took a breath. The final speech of her career was about to begin. Her voice, though calm, carried a weight of finality. "I have served this country with everything I have," she began. "But leadership is about knowing when to fight and when to pass the torch." The reporters froze. Was she admitting defeat? She continued, her voice steady. "I have always believed in the power of democracy. And today, I hear that democracy speaking." A long pause, and then, "It's time for a new chapter." Gasps rippled through the room. The headlines were already being written. Nancy Pelosi had just signaled the end. The political world would never be the same.